Welcome to a special edition of the Share Life podcast. We're in an ongoing series as part of the discovery process for my next book project, From the Garden to the Cross, how Jesus' harrowing mission shows us the way forward. Today in this discussion, we're reflecting on Judas's death and how the money paid to him for his betrayal of Jesus was used by the religious leaders after he returned it. So I'm Jason Scott Montoya, author and creator, sharing stories and systems to live better and work smarter. Today, I'm joined by David, Ashley, and Talitha. Ashley, say hello.
Hey.
Ashley Christine Williams is a wife, a mother to four, pursuer of truth, avid reader, political enthusiast, and an elementary school teacher. David, say hello.
Hello.
David Klein is a relationally oriented supply chain leadership, guiding businesses on how to remove operational friction while also growing supplier value. Talitha, say hello.
Hi.
Talitha James Minton is a book lover, writer, learner, creator, wife, and mother with an educational background in classical literature and religious studies. So thank you all for joining us on this discussion. Let's jump into the passage about Judas and his conversation with the religious leaders, the ending of his life, and perhaps the legacy he left behind. We'll read and discuss my harmonization of the story with the different accounts of Jesus's life, with quotes from the New Living Translation. Then we'll explore the story through the following questions. What can we learn about Jesus, humanity, and ourselves from this monumental moment in time? How does it apply to us today? And essentially, what can we learn from this story? So for those of us that are just now joining into this discussion, this event that we're speaking of takes place after Judas has betrayed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's led the religious leaders and some Roman soldiers to arrest Jesus in the garden. And so this is some point after that, and after he was paid the 30 pieces of silver. So let's jump into the passage. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we will go ahead and read this passage here. All right. So this is from two places, Matthew 27, 3 through 10, and Acts 1, 18 through 19, for those that want to look into this. And here we go. Recognizing his betrayal of an innocent man condemned to death, Judas was overwhelmed with remorse for delivering Jesus to the religious leaders. He decided to return the 30 silver coins paid to him for his treachery. In the presence of the leading priests and elders, Judas spoke, "I have sinned, for I betrayed an innocent man." Apathetically, they responded, "What do we care? That's your problem." Judas threw the silver coins in the temple and fled. After picking up the silver, the high priest contemplated what to do about the coins. It would not be right to put this money in the temple treasury, since it was payment for murder. After Judas departed the temple, he went to the field where he had initiated a land purchase. There he hung himself, and after hanging for some period of time, his body swelled up, split open, and his guts spilled out below. The news of Judas's death spread to all the people of Jerusalem, and the parcel of land where he died came to be known as the Field of Blood. The temple leaders decided to finish the land purchase transaction Judas began with the betrayal money and purchased this potter's field, also known as the Field of Blood, where Judas had died, as a cemetery for foreigners. These events fulfilled Jeremiah's prophecy from 600 years before. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price at which he was valued by the people of Israel, and purchased the potter's field as the Lord directed. So my question to all of you, and I'll start us out here, is what in this particular passage, what in this story is what sticks out for you? I think for me, there's a lot that's in here, and then there's a lot of backstory, and then there's a lot that we can sort of speculate about. But I think the thing that's struck me is just how apathetic the religious leaders were to Judas' response. The irony of the religious leaders being these highly righteous people, supposedly, and they're having this conversation about someone who has turned someone over to be executed, and he's feeling remorse, and yet they could care less. And that's one of the things that really struck me, and something to kind of explore further. Ashley, what is it for you that sticks out?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of what you were talking about, the pathetic response of the religious leaders in a situation to a person coming in and saying, I have sinned, I have betrayed an innocent man. The pain and emotional response that Judas must have been feeling and having at that time seems so downplayed in this passage to me. His feeling of shame, his concern over what had happened. And we can probably touch into this later in the passage that talks about Satan entering into Judas. Was that something he knew? Has he just, is that something that we believe happened? And going forward, how was Judas responding to that? So down where it talks about the high priests not wanting to put the payment for the murder back into the temple treasury is an interesting statement to me as well, because they didn't have any problem paying for the murder.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why the concern now?
And it's also similar to I believe it's the passage right after this where the religious leaders bring Jesus to Pilate, but they won't enter the temple because that would make them ceremonial unclean and they can't participate in the Passover.
Right.
So there's this disconnect that seems obvious to us, obviously looking in hindsight,
right.
but obviously that wasn't what they experienced or saw or believed it was. So it's very interesting. So Talitha, what are your first thoughts? What sticks out to you?
This story has always struck me as just being so incredibly tragic.
Mm-hmm.
That this guy who possibly thought he was doing the right thing to force Jesus to confront, the powers that be and do what he thought Jesus needed to do, ends up being one of the reasons that he gets killed.
Mm-hmm.
And how he gets arrested, and just how it completely devastated him. And you can see it, that he's just like, I can't believe I did this. This is not what was supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so just the fact that he does what he goes and he talks to them, and then he ends up killing himself. And it's just awful.
Yeah.
And it's just tragic that that's what he thought was the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the tragedy is definitely something that I lean into, and even in the sense of, like, if he had hit the timing of his suicide, and the timing of Jesus' resurrection, like if he had just waited, perhaps there would have been an opportunity, right? But to act in the way that he did, in the timing of it is also what makes it tragic, which is an interesting thing to reflect on. But David, what is it for you that sticks out?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just reading the story from the perspective of Judas is very different than when you think about it as you tell it to a toddler or a young child. From Jesus' perspective, it's Judas is just the bad guy. It's kind of like the villain in a Disney movie or something. We don't really think about why he did what he did, or why he was so remorseful that he would go and hang himself. But just that's what was prophesied, and there had to be a bad guy, and that's the role that he played. So I think it's really fascinating when you read the story from Judas' perspective, and you think about someone that spent so long with Jesus and the disciples, and then what compelled him to do a fairly small bribe, to take a small bribe for this betrayal, and then why was he so remorseful? And I think as we've kind of researched and talked about that in preparation for this, that's the thing that's been most interesting to me, is just thinking about his emotional state and his motivations, and then kind of what we learn about Jesus and ourselves from thinking about the story from his perspective.
So what do you think's going on there? Why are we so inclined to sort of make Judas separate than ourselves? Like, that's not me. He's a bad guy. What's going on there?
Well, I think the simple story makes it a little bit more palatable, especially, if we are familiar with the story from a child. Um,
Mhm.
we just sort of say he's the bad guy, and the bad guy is never us. We never identify with the bad guy, at least as a young child. And I think when you grow older, you just kind of accept the simple story and don't really think about the motivations of somebody that, why would he spend so long with Jesus? Was it purely nefarious that he was just trying to get close to hurt him for some unknown reason? Or, was it that he was actually a Jesus follower? And that's really uncomfortable to think about, because as somebody that follows Jesus, I would like to think that there's no way that I would betray Jesus in that way, especially after walking with him and spending, years with him.
Yeah.
But if we start to think about the story from that perspective, we go, wow, maybe there is a cautionary tale for us about checking our own motivations and kind of what we're wanting from Jesus as we're following Jesus.
Hmm. Yeah, and so one of the things that comes to my mind is, and going back to what you said, Talitha, about the tragedy. Um, Part of, I can think of, like, there's movies or maybe personal experiences where we do something and it's wrong, but it's small in our mind, but then it unravels really rapidly into like something really big. And that's the impression I get, is that whatever Judas did, he didn't anticipate it to unravel the way in which it did. And so there's obviously a disconnect between what he was expecting to happen. I don't know if it's simply that he thought he was, Jesus was just going to be punished in some kind of a, um, I don't know, imprisoned or something, but didn't expect that he would be crucified. And that seems to be the distinction between the difference between what he was expecting versus what happened. But when you think about the tragedy, Talitha, what is, dive into that a little bit deeper, and what it is you mean, and how you see that.
Well, and I wish I knew where this thought process comes from, but as a kid, I was always taught that Judas did this because he wanted Christ to be like the warrior,
Mm-hmm.
to come down, topple everything, start over, wipe it away, get them out of Rome's power, all of that stuff. And so this was his way of forcing Jesus's hand. Like, surely he's not going to let himself get arrested. Surely he's not going to willingly submit to the power of Rome or the power of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
And so I think I was always told it from the perspective that Judas was trying to force who he thought Christ was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Instead of just accepting that maybe he didn't have the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he didn't really know what the end goal was. And maybe the kingdom coming back didn't look the way he thought it should look. He was expecting this triumphant entry of a military leader or whatever. And that's not what he had.
Yeah.
And the fact that he spent so long with Jesus and didn't see that and stuff, Jesus isn't known for being, he's controversial and he, flipped tables in the temple and stuff, but he wasn't a violent guy.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't an aggressive guy.
Yeah.
So I always wondered, like, why on earth did you think that this was going to work?
But
Well, you go ahead, David.
you have to think, though, it wasn't just Judas. It was
Yeah.
all of the disciples. As we hear about how they reacted to Jesus being crucified, and even Peter, denying having known Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of them were kind of blindsided, and you do wonder, how was it after spending so long with him, and after he said so plainly so many times what was coming, but they just had their mindset was stuck on a physical kingdom, and that he was eventually going to be ruler of the earth, not a different kingdom.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the contrast between Peter and Judas is interesting. And to your points, they're in a weird way. It's like Jesus is their pawn. Judas is acting this way. Peter's acting this way. And there's actually an interesting intersection. But they're both, there is a root dynamic there that's similar in terms of that battle, that fight, that sort of physical material overthrow with a missing of the spiritual dynamic.
Yeah.
So how does that, and how does, I guess, Ashley, pull us into the dynamic with these religious leaders, and how does that amplify or further complexify this situation here?
Right. I think the religious leaders at the time were struggling to maintain their power after coming under the rule of Rome. Having Jesus, even though Jesus was the prophesied Messiah of the Jews, they had known that this person was supposed to be coming, but they also had this vision of what this person was going to be, this warrior Messiah who was going to lead them out of the oppression from Rome, similar to how he led the Israelites out of the oppression from the Egyptians. And when the Messiah came, they saw that he was not fitting into that mold. That not only was he not fitting into that mold, but he was blatantly calling out their behavior and their sin and telling them that the way they were doing religion was wrong. So now they appear to be fighting two battles on two fronts. They're fighting against Jesus and maintaining their power within their temple and the Jewish religion, and then they're fighting Rome. Mm-hmm. So when you see them going to Rome to get this permission to crucify Jesus, it's almost like they're using this like as a two-bird, one-stone situation. Yeah. They're like, Jesus is going to be a threat to you too. Let us help you. Mm-hmm. And, this also just ended up benefiting us. They thought they were very clever in this situation. And I like what you guys are saying about Judas and Peter both trying to get, everyone seems to be trying to get Jesus to be what they want him to be.
Yeah.
To force his hand into a situation where that they envision how they want the story to go.
And when you say that, I mean, I can't help but just think of the political situation we're now in, and particularly the evangelical, where everyone's Jesus this, Jesus that. He's this political affiliation, that one. Right. This is what he is or isn't, and we're all using him as a pawn in a very similar way, it seems mm-hmm. like.
Absolutely. We all want to see our beliefs and the way we view the world is right. We all, kind of what David was saying, we never see ourselves as the villain. And so when we believe what we're doing is ordained by God, then how could we possibly be wrong?
Yeah. And I guess the irony of that, it seems like there's an irony because of the story itself, the Judas story, right?
Right.
David, what do you think?
I just think it's funny that everybody thought that Jesus' power and influence would come through force. And so it seems to have caught everybody, the religious leaders, Rome, the disciples, and especially Judas off guard that, in some ways, Judas, I think, banked everything on this, 30 silver coins, which, that's a few weeks income. So it's not like a life-changing amount of money. I don't think he was motivated by, a desire to get rich or that he was going to be set for life or anything. But, he thought that was going to force Jesus's hand, or at least force something to happen so that there's going to be, some fighting. There's going to be, some physical battle, and Jesus's power is going to be manifest in being able to take physical force. And Jesus's, solution is just to submit and to kind of lay down and serve. And I think that's that's a fascinating part of the gospel itself, but especially in the way that it, affected the people around him that were closest to him, that were expecting him to rise up and take power. And instead, he applied the servant leadership and dying for the sins of the world rather than, taking over by power.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about, I guess when we go to the beginning of this passage, Judas has done something, and he's now remorseful. So when you think about what does that mean? What's going on? Is he just feeling bad that he did something, or is he truly feeling remorseful? Like, how do you all, interpret that? Talitha, what do you think?
I always interpreted it like just this ultimate sense of just guilt
Mhm.
and regret and remorse and like being just horrified
Mhm.
that this guy that he's been following for so long is going to be crucified. Like, he knows where this is going because he can see it. And it's like, I never assumed he felt anything other than completely awful for the role he played.
Yeah. And so how do you connect the dots between that and taking his own life?
I think if that's the case, then he did take his own life, because obviously the different gospels have different. Some of them say he just fell over and exploded. Some of them say he hung himself and then exploded. So who knows? But if in fact he did commit suicide, it just shows that he felt more guilt and more shame about an action that he did than Christ ever would have.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he assumed that, oh, I've done something horrible. This is unforgivable. I gotta go. I can't be a part of this anymore. No one's going to forgive me. My life is worthless. I'm a horrible person. I'm ending it now.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, and then you compare that to Peter, who, I mean, granted, his betrayal, if we're measuring levels of betrayal, Peter's wasn't as bad. But Peter never doubted forgiveness. He never
Mm-hmm.
doubted that he wasn't worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And stuff the way Judas did. Like, you can see that Judas must have just felt so unworthy of even the disciples' forgiveness at that point, thinking that probably Jesus was going to die and not come back, because that's not what any of them expected.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting in a couple things, you mentioned the differences in the accounts of the story and reconciling those. This just occurred to me, but there is an interesting aspect of those tension or those elements almost forcing us to realize this isn't a simple story. Like, this is something that we have to reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
And is that there for us to sort of slow us down enough to notice that's one thing that came to mind. The other thing is, I think, to your point, is there is an aspect that perhaps the difference between Peter and Judas, with Judas, where he was essentially feeling responsible for what he had done, and that he was the one in which to deal out the justice of what he had done. Like, I did this, so in turn I need to punish myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Peter received that gift of forgiveness, and so what's the difference there? What's going on? But anyway, Ashley, I think you were going to say something. What's going on?
Just to the point of the suicide with Judas, what I see when I look at that story and Judas's ultimate suicide is the powerlessness that he must have felt in his ability to correct the situation or come back from it. That the suicide was what he believed was within his power, whether that be
Okay. That's
justice
interesting.
for himself or just reparations for his actions. The interesting thing about Judas and Peter too is Peter betrays Jesus 3 times, and after each time and repents and asks for forgiveness. Obviously, we don't know the timelines of all these things unfolding. had Judas been able to witness Peter's betrayal,
Would it have made a difference?
repentance, would that have changed Judas's perspective on his own ability to gain forgiveness?
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of what ifs, that being
Yeah.
one of the many. Like, what if this? What if that? And that's those what ifs almost makes it more tragic. Like, wow,
Right.
what if? What if?
It's a missed opportunities. That's
Yeah.
right. If he had waited until the resurrection, or
Mhm.
did he wait till after? What
Yeah.
was the timeline of all of this?
Yeah.
But I think there's also an aspect of, so that's the context in which he's in. But then there's his choice that even in the perfect circumstances, he may have chose the same thing, right?
Right.
Mhm.
So, but you made the comment about like how taking his life was taking control. Like, dive into that, because that's interesting. What does
Well,
that mean?
just so, just from my studying of the reasons people commit suicide, and just knowing several people who have committed suicide or attempted committing suicide, it often doesn't look bad from the outside when we look at these people's lives. The commonality is this feeling of powerlessness, this feeling of a lack of control over one's circumstances or one's own life, even if everything on the outside looks good. So with Judas's situation, he had already reached out to the religious entity of the main religion of that time, and one that he would have grown up in. He had already gone to them to say, I am a sinner. He was doing the right thing. I don't know if he thought that they were going to tell him how to repent for those sins and to make it right with God. And then when they were so apathetic towards him and showing complete lack of concern for him, did he see his soul as being lost? Did he see himself as being even more powerless to overcome his own guilt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I get that. Yeah, what's interesting is just the contrast between, and I think perhaps one of the things that's unfolding here is everyone is trying to control in their different ways, and they're trying to use Jesus as a pawn, but it's not working out the way they wanted or expected, and so their response to that is almost their raw character, if you will.
Right, just carnal emotions.
Yeah, they're just, they almost like they reverted perhaps back to a version of themselves they were before they even met Jesus.
Right, before they became the disciples.
Yeah. David, what else would you add to that?
Well, it's interesting, the reversion, if they're suddenly thinking, I've been living a lie, I've been following this person, giving up everything to exclusively follow Jesus for, several years. And now at the end of the season, he's not who they thought that he was. Maybe that does cause you to question everything, all the growth, all of the personal and spiritual development that's happened. If you're not living the story that you thought that you were, the narrative that you thought was unfolding. The thing I was going to say that's interesting about Peter is he doesn't do anything to try to make it right. Compared to Judas, immediately going, I want to repay the money that I gained from accepting this bribe, and it seems to be that he's trying to atone for his sin. He's in a lot of ways responding how I would if I got caught doing something. I cheated on my taxes. It'd be, can I repay this? How do I make this right? And you don't see that from Peter, which I think is interesting compared to Judas. That Judas is responding in a lot of ways how we naturally respond to being caught, defined by a failure. Is how can I, redeem my name or restore my legacy, so that I'm not defined by this one failure. And so he goes all the way to the point of taking his own life to say, look how sorry I am, look how,
Yeah.
contrite I am. And, you don't see any of that from Peter. He just takes that shame and that probably feeling of having betrayed his Lord, and takes it to Jesus, even though it's got to be uncomfortable to face Jesus, and in that moment of making eye contact to say, I betrayed you. That's what Judas, I guess, didn't have the courage to do, was to face the consequences without just trying to atone for his own sin.
Yeah. The thing that you said a lot there that we could certainly dive into. One of the things that really, I guess, resonated with me is just the difference between what we expect and what's real, and I guess perhaps how deceived we are in buying into that dream world, that perception bubble, and it gets popped at some point. And I think that's all something we can relate to. Talitha, you want to dive into that from your own experiences?
Of getting the expectations completely popped.
Yeah, what you thought was one thing and what reality was a whole nother.
Oh yeah. Because I grew up pretty fundamentalist evangelical and thought forever that we were the good guys. We did everything right. And as I've gotten older,
even among other Christians, like you were the right Christians.
Oh, yeah, okay. No, we were the right Christians.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, and Catholics were not Christian. Like those didn't count.
Yeah. No.
I was in college when I found out that was false. So yeah. But there was a lot of getting out in the world and seeing beyond the little homeschool Christian bubble I grew up in, and realizing that the church has hurt a lot of people. And it's been behind a lot of atrocities around the world for centuries, because they all thought they were doing the right thing. And it was like, wait a minute, we're the Pharisees in this story. We're not Jesus. We're not the persecuted. We're the ones making it harder for everybody else to just live their life. And realizing that was kind of mind-blowing and blew all of my perceptions out of the water.
Was it instantaneous, or was it a slow process that unfolded over time, over years?
I think it was a fairly slow process. It picked up speed in college because I was just around a lot more people that believed differently than I did. Then, like, I had, your average, like, after school jobs. Like, I worked at a restaurant, and I taught gymnastics for a bit, and with Ashley. And I was exposed in like little ways then. And so I had like little glimpses into how people thought, but it wasn't until college where I was on my own, surrounded by people who believed differently than I did. And I had to reconcile it and reconcile why some of them weren't Christian, because I knew no one who wasn't a Christian. Everyone I knew was a Christian growing up. So that was a foreign concept to be like, wait, why aren't you a Christian? And then hearing the stories of, oh, well, I'm gay, and if I got kicked out of my house, or I got kicked out of my church, and hearing stories like that,
one after the next,
one after the other, it was so horrifying to be like, wait a minute, that's not what God's love's about at all.
So how did you reconcile that difference? Like, here's Jesus, and then here are all these people I grew up with that said they were following him, but they don't seem to be like him. So how did you reconcile that or explain it?
I realized that it's one of those, it's the tale as old as time. It's the religious leaders think they're doing all the right things, but it's all in the name of power. That's all it is. And that's all it feels like it ever will be sometimes, is that it's just about power and who controls the purse strings and who, manipulates the political leaders and who knows all of that stuff. And I don't know if I've entirely reconciled it, because it's just kind of, especially over the last 5 years. It's been rather disheartening. To see who I thought were the good guys really prove themselves to not be.
Mhm.
Even members of my own family that I thought were good Christians have said some stuff over the past few years that have really made me take a good hard look at who I'm around and who my kid's going to be around when he gets older,
Mhm.
and reconciling that that's not who I want to raise my kid to be. And
Mhm.
that's not the environment I want to raise my kid in.
Yeah.
So the indoctrination to good Christianity is going to start real young.
So, Ashley, what would you say is the difference between, and I don't, what between someone who is an honest follower of Christ and is screwing up along the way, failing, versus someone that's just corrupt to the core? I think as some of what Talitha was inferring.
Yeah. So I think a person who's just screwing up along the way is just really a good example of how we all are. We're all screwing up along the way, who we would consider to be somebody who would make the statement, I am a Christian. Those are usually the people who, if we're talking about just believe that who aren't burdened with the trauma of indoctrinated religion from a young age, but who accept that their sins can be forgiven and don't define who they are in the end, versus somebody who is truly corrupt, who weaponizes religion for their own gain, regardless of who it hurts along the way. And I do believe that those types of people can still be redeemed through repentance and reconciliation. To touch on Talitha's point about reconciling this way of now having to view people who claim to be Christians but who do seem to be along the lines of Pharisees, more along the lines of Pharisees than along the lines of Jesus, is just for me, it was recognizing that people will weaponize religion for their own gains and weaponize religion in their fear of things that are different than them. And that it happens across all religions at all times. And so for me, realizing that that's not what those religions are about, that is actually what people are doing, that truly speaks to the fallenness of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's kind of how I have it. I think David has touched on it a little bit more in some of our chats. David, how do you got something to add to my question, to my answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure grace is messy, and so when you say, that people try to weaponize it, I think what it is it's still trying to get that sense of control.
Hmm.
If somebody does something wrong, and that's what the law was. I mean, until Jesus' death and resurrection, at the time of Judas, assuming that his suicide was before Jesus was raised from the dead, there was no defeat of death. There was no, your sins and your failures did define you, and
Hmm.
unless you had something to atone for that, sacrifice or whatever it was, you had to earn your way back into, I would say, into grace, but it wasn't grace. It was, you had to earn your way back into good standing,
Hmm.
and that's all that the law brought. And I think we let that thinking creep into our thinking about grace and the gospel message, and it really confuses us because the idea of giving somebody grace that doesn't deserve it, it flies in the face of everything that seems like it should be right and just. And um, and and so I think that's, it's interesting that Judas was living in that paradigm, and he basically had done something that was worthy of dying, and executed himself to say, this defined me, and I can't make this right. And so when we go into that mindset, we condemn ourselves, I think, and we condemn people around us. We see God as this, you know law doling out, all powerful being, not the God that would send Jesus to lay down his life for
Mhm.
people that didn't deserve it. And once that thinking creeps in, I think just the power piece takes over. And that's kind of what happened with Judas. I mean, you see it throughout his time following Jesus, that he's, taking some money on the side. He's obviously, still got this kind of penchant for, you know, taking care of himself, and he's not fully wholeheartedly following Jesus, and I think that might be the reason that he struggled to reconcile that, possibly Jesus could forgive him for what he'd done.
Yeah.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback back again off of what David was saying, is that
Back on the
old,
piggyback.
similar to like old habits died. Did I get that right? Old habits kind of died hard. Judas would have been raised during a time when your sins could be repented for with a price, a sacrifice. The Leviticus laws that the Jews followed talk in depth. There's so many of them. He had been with Jesus for just a short time of his life compared to the way he was raised. And I know for me personally, I constantly have to fight against the way I was raised, and realizing that that is wrong, and moving forward and not having this crushing shame or crushing guilt of being told that if I did these things, I was going to go to hell, and
Mhm.
realizing that that was wrong. But I still struggle with that. And so it seems like Judas was reverting back to the way he was raised in the Jewish religion of his time compared to the short
Yeah.
time that he had been with Christ.
Well, my impression too is that the religious leaders they're a voice in his ear
Right.
throughout the whole time he's following Christ, as far as I can tell, and and that's playing. Part of it is Judas was using Jesus for his end outcome, but here we realized that he was being used by the religious leaders for their desired outcome, right? And it's like a Russian nesting dolls of control and power that just okay, who's controlling who's, and then where does it go?
That's a great way of describing that.
Yeah.
So let's, I guess, dive in a little bit to the on the religious leader side of it, and the fact that they didn't care. It wasn't their problem, that they didn't want to use the money in the treasury, because that would be payment for murder. Talitha, what do you have to say about that?
But yeah, like what Ashley mentioned earlier, the irony of, no, we can't take this money back, it was used for murder. And it's like, what did you think it was leaving the treasury for in the first place? But it boggles my mind that they could see his grief and his remorse and his guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something in their law. I mean, they had 600 and something laws at that point. It's like, there was something in their law that they could have told them to do. There was.
Yeah. Well,
and they didn't.
Yeah, that's one of those what ifs. Like, what if they had actually responded with compassion?
Yeah, right. Or just responded with, "We need 2 white doves. Go get them, bring them back. We're going to feed a sheep," whatever it was at the time. Yeah. And that would have been it. And Judas probably would have accepted that and moved on.
Yeah.
But because they were like, yeah, it's not my problem, dude. You figured this out. And he didn't know what to do.
I think it is that they were just wanting to be rid of them, wanting to be rid of him, because he was the thing that tied them to Jesus's death.
Yep.
So
they couldn't blame it on. It's true. I mean, Judas was there. Yeah, Judas was the loose end, because otherwise they could just blame Rome.
I think they were coming for him next.
Yeah. I would not be surprised.
Yeah. David, how do we make sure that we're not those religious leaders?
Boy, that's a
how do we know? How do we know we're not them?
I definitely think that they were mostly concerned about their control of the situation. So when we get mostly concerned about being in control or feeling like we are, keeping all the laws, I think that's where we're in danger of going down that road. Whether it's, we're self-protection, somebody might know something about me that would, make me unclean or could tarnish my reputation. And so I'm going to tie up a loose end there, or whether it's, we're going to, maintain the system of you've got to earn salvation, you've got to earn your redemption, to be able to stay in good graces or stay in good standing with the church or with religion. I think that's where we begin to go down that road of reputation management and image management over actually being curious about what's really going on. And I think that's why they were able to miss Jesus, and that's why they were able to be so cavalier towards Judas and his remorse and repentance, because they were primarily concerned about their control and their ability to be in charge of whatever's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ashley, what would you say to those questions?
David does touch on a great point of recognizing when we are trying to be in control to level of situations. Even in myself, I do notice that I act outside of my typical character when trying to control situations. I think being incredibly self-aware and having friends that hold you to a high level of accountability and just really being honest with yourself in situations that make you uncomfortable and scare you is a way to constantly be checking for those characteristics. It's so easy to see it in other people. And I think a thing that I started doing several years ago was I noticed myself calling out other people's bad behaviors, but never being my own. And so now what I do is when I see a behavior in someone else, it immediately makes me check myself where someone else could say the same thing about me in another situation. But
like as a mirror.
Right. That takes a high level of self-awareness. And I, by no stretch of the imagination, am perfect at that.
Yeah.
I think the community is definitely a huge piece, because having people to reflect back what they see in you or what you see in them, and then evaluate if you see that in yourself. Another way that a question I've started asking myself is, what if I'm not as right as I think I am? And especially, when you start thinking about politics and religion and politics and religion and social issues and people are quick to take sides and kind of create their allies and say, surround themselves with people that are sure that they're right and will reaffirm that they're right. Instead, maybe it's better to question, what would I do here if I wasn't right, or what would it look like? How would I know if I'm not as right as I think I am?
Yeah, and I was listening to Adam Grant on the Knowledge Project podcast, and he made a comment that was really interesting. He said one of the kind of habits he's developing is, what would it take for me to change my mind about this thing, and actually writing it down. And then he also explored like the idea of like, okay, what's not just making a case for what I want, but what's the case against it, and writing that down as well. But these exercises to recognize, to humble ourselves and to recognize our fallibility. And some of these matters, they're so severe, or the consequences are so severe that like to not do these things would be foolish in a lot of ways. But sometimes these situations unfold and we don't necessarily know that they're coming. And so we don't prepare for them ahead of time. And when they hit, we respond the way we respond. I think one of the things that stuck out with what you said was just the community piece. And in contrast to that, the isolation of Judas. Talitha, what would you speak into about just the idea of isolating ourselves and the danger of doing that?
Oh, that's what I did in college. I severely self-isolated and didn't realize I was doing it until I had some major bouts of depression. And it took me like going to my parents and saying, I'm pretty sure I have depression, because the little checklist they have online, I was like, yeah, I have 8 out of 10. We should go see someone. But it wasn't until things started unraveling around me and I realized how I wasn't handling stress well, and I wasn't talking to people. Like, I would go to class and I would go back to my apartment and I would study by myself and I ate by myself, and like, I had roommates, but we were on opposite schedules. And it is amazing how in your head you can live when you isolate that much, and how you create your own echo chamber where your mind will confirm everything you think about yourself, no matter how completely crazy it is.
Yeah.
Because
it could get crazy.
Yeah, because you're the only thing that's checking you is you.
Which,
and unless you have the force, unless you have the capability of seeing it and recognizing it for what it is and going, oh no, okay, help please, this is not good, this is bad.
yeah.
But it took almost like a panic attack for me to realize what was going on. And realizing that at the time, like, I don't think I was suicidal, but I probably wasn't super far from it, just in the amount of how isolated I had made myself.
Yeah.
And stuff. And it can be so dangerous. And it always struck me that Judas went to the church leaders. He didn't go to the disciples. He didn't go to his 11 other friends and say, I screwed up. He went to the religious leaders first, which is, I kind of get, because they were in on it and his other friends probably didn't know, and he didn't want to have to out himself and say, I'm the reason this is all going down.
He would have had to face, because none of them expected Judas to betray Jesus.
Right.
And when he did, that was surprising, I think. And so he would have had to face them. Yeah. And that's a whole nother dynamic I hadn't even considered.
Owning your own mistakes is difficult and humbling, and you have to be willing to completely make yourself vulnerable to being hurt. And it is a difficult thing to do.
That does bring up a pretty interesting other point, is what do we know about the relationship between Judas and the other disciples? And what made Judas, how did this story play out? Did Judas first approach the Pharisees and say that he would betray Jesus, or did the Pharisees seek him out?
Yeah.
Well, my impression, there's not a lot of details to go into that, but there's a few things that make me lead to a particular conclusion. One is that isolation piece. From what I understand, Judas was one of the disciples that came from a different area. So he was kind of an outsider in the group. He, when I think about people that are like human trafficked or kidnapped or taken advantage of or abuse, a lot of them they're usually like from broken homes and have broken histories and are broken people in a lot of ways, and those people are the most susceptible to that type of crime. So part of me wonders if those were similar dynamics unfolding here that may have contributed to him being participating or picked off, or maybe he reached out to them. I don't know the specifics, or I don't know if we have enough details to know that answer, but those are a couple things that come to mind.
Yeah, it would be interesting, because if Judas was already a broken person, but had been with Jesus for a few years and had been around the other disciples, were those relationships already broken? I know there's a verse in John that talks about them saying Judas took money out of the money bag.
If they all knew he was stealing, and Jesus wasn't doing anything about it, that would isolate him further.
Right. So was he already not with the in group of the other 11 disciples? Was he already, would they have even been in a place to forgive him? Had they already made him up to be less than them in their mind, because Peter had no problem going back to them.
Right.
Yeah, although I mean, a lot of that was after the resurrection that they came together.
That's true. A
but-
lot of that was after the resurrection.
So it's hard to
So
tell.
it's another of that mistiming opportunity there.
But it's hard. I think some of them probably clumped together, but I don't know to what degree. David, what were you gonna say?
I just think it's really interesting, that dynamic of what shame does and isolates us, especially, you know, shame when you know something that you've done that's wrong that nobody else knows. I think that's even more isolating than just having done something wrong and everybody knows it. You know, there's a level of shame that's like, I'm embarrassed and I hate that people know this. But when there's a shame that is like a secret, that you've maintained an image, I feel like that's even more isolating. And so he probably was, I mean, even if only in his own head, you know, isolating himself or managing his reputation around the guys that were closest to him. And that would have been, you know, only compounded by, now I've got this even bigger sin that, you know, they didn't even know about the stealing money stuff. And now I've got this, you know, betraying Christ and him dying for my sin, literally, you know. I think that would have just compounded that. And like you said, Talitha, I think that the power of just isolation, you know, once you've got some shame about something in yourself, we just, you know, since the Garden of Eden, you know, it's I know I've done something wrong and now I want to hide that from everybody. I mean,
Yeah. I want to hide in the forest, cover myself,
Mhm.
and then just pretend like God can't see me. So one thing I want to pull back to, Ashley, you talked about the mirror of, you know, calling out someone else versus yourself. And I think there's a variety of ways that we can sort of dive into Judas's mindset, because we don't have enough details to know exactly what it is, right? We talked about the control, but I think there is one that's possibly like a policing mindset, that he perhaps was there to, that he thought Jesus was a false Messiah, that he wasn't who he said he was, and he was there to make sure that he kept Jesus in check, so to speak. What do you all, you know, Ashley, what do you think about that as is that a potential point of view of Judas, that he slowly sort of built resentment and bitterness towards Jesus because he thought he was wrong and he was right?
It's completely possible that he was looking at it from again, being raised in the Jewish religion with the prophecy of the Messiah coming to bring freedom to the Jewish people. It is possible that he was looking at that and saying, well, if this guy is who he claims to be, and I see him deviating from that path, maybe that it is my higher calling as one of these disciples to guide his path.
Yeah. Because I see a lot of people, like even in the political realm, and I can even see myself like as this sort of like guru that's going to pave the way, but I actually have it completely wrong, or that person has it completely wrong. And they think they're there to make things right, you know?
Yeah. And often I feel like when we have that mentality, that it often ends up making it worse, which is definitely what happened in this situation.
Yeah.
And whether or not Judas believed or knew or had any inkling about the crucifixion, he may have known that was their plan and just truly believed that Jesus would never allow himself to succumb to that. And then there would also be that fear, because I think I heard this in one of your other podcasts. We are always willing to die fighting for what we believe is right, but we're never willing to suffer or have shame for what we may be wrong about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that is, Judas really did believe that the Messiah was coming, and he seemed to believe that Jesus was the Messiah and wanted to force him into that situation, and seemed to be ready to fight to the end for that, what he envisioned that looking like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's part of it is like, was there a clear vision, or was it just a cloudy future? Was it just a cloudiness of of a short-term mindset.
Yeah. It appeared very short term because he didn't see past the possibility of his plan failing. He went into it, appeared to go into it, because as David said earlier, 30 pieces of silver was not worth throwing your life away for.
No.
It wasn't like an amount of money that was going to take care of
Right. That wasn't setting him up
No.
for life. He wasn't going to retire to Greece somewhere and live a Mediterranean lifestyle. He was definitely going to have to, there was going to need to be some plan B there. He didn't appear. It seemed very short-sighted. I really do think that Judas believed he was forcing Jesus's hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did not see the possibility of that failing.
Yeah, that's interesting because he was so convinced in that mindset that it was that to like there was no being wrong. Like it was either he was right or his ultimate demise was.
It was a very all or nothing
inevitable.
bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He put all his eggs in that basket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's funny. That kind of reminds me of the Big Lie and the way that people responded to, evidence that would say, what you thought was happening isn't what was happening. And there's people that just, even to this day are still sure that it's, false evidence that the narrative that they originally latched onto has to be true.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like that has to be attached to something deeper. And that is the escalation that perhaps if you talked to that person 5 years ago, they would never have imagined it escalating to that level. But slowly and surely we end up in those places where we're cornered and our pride takes over, right? And that's all we see.
We accumulate more and more of our reputation or our life. We've invested more and more in what we believe is going on. So I think, it gets harder and harder to say, well, what if I'm not in the story I think I'm in? The implications get bigger and bigger. And so I think our cognitive bias just gets, we're quick to assure ourselves that we have to be right, because if we're not, then everything unravels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think the part of that to actually fight against that is to have a posture and a disposition that I could be wrong, and that the story that I'm building, what's some other feedback to contribute to that? Because I think even if we don't want that to happen, without the right posture, I think it's almost inevitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
even with community, you can surround yourself with like-minded people. You can surround yourself with other Pharisees or people that believe like you do politically or whatever. And even though you've expanded the echo chamber outside your own head, you really haven't. You've just surrounded yourself. I mean, social media makes that really easy, that we can find people that think and see the world exactly how we do, and will assure us that we're right. And I think that lets us go a lot further, a lot faster, down a wrong road, even with community around us, can almost reinforce that if we're not careful to curate people that will tell us what we don't want to hear.
Yeah. So let's dive into that concept of legacy and rapport and reputation and renown. Obviously a lot of people found out about Judas's death, and they named this field the Field of Blood. But there is an interesting discussion there just about the legacy of Judas and our legacies, and how does that intersect? And so what would you add to that, David, when you think about it through that lens?
I think it's really interesting what Judas' legacy would have been if he had just disappeared with the money. He would have been the guy that betrayed the risen Christ for 30 silver coins. And maybe the story would have ended differently if he'd seen the resurrection. But, I think he realized in that moment that's not the legacy he wanted. And so he set out trying to say, well, I don't want to be the guy that got 30 coins, for betraying Christ. And then he just kept going down that road of I've got to redeem my legacy, or redeem my role in the story. I don't want to be known as the villain in the story. And I think it's
Interesting.
really interesting how we kind of do that same thing. We don't want to be the villain in the story. There's a song right now that's like, it's okay, I can be the villain in your story, and that's a really tough thing to be just okay with the idea of accepting our responsibility, and that it might tarnish our legacy.
Yeah, and that's what we saw with Christ, is Jesus accepted the villain role, I guess, in a sense that they made him the villain and crucified him. And yet that was undeserved. So, but yeah, that's interesting, that just the that he didn't want his legacy to be that, and he tried to erase what he had done, but he couldn't.
Mhm.
It was irreversible in a sense, and I guess even the way he responded almost cemented that terrible legacy that he had, right?
Yeah.
But I think on the flip side, there is a legacy there of perhaps a redemptive angle of it, where we can see Judas's story for our benefit in a positive way. That had that story, had he not been in the story and had he not played out, we wouldn't learn the things that he should have learned, that we can now learn. I think that's another side of it. I don't know. What do you think, Ashley?
Yeah, I think Judas's story really does show us that we can be our most harsh critic, our harshest critic. Jesus spoke about redemption for all sins, and Judas, even knowing that, could not bring himself to accept that he would be reciprocating of that forgiveness, or somebody who could receive that forgiveness. He did not believe it. And I think we often do that thing when we do things that we are ashamed of or regret or have guilt over. We don't see how people can forgive us, how we can come back from that, how it can change the way people perceive us. That's why we try and do like all these things to make it right. Or try and control a situation to manipulating it into something that makes us look better. So I think it does just kind of open my eyes to being like, hey, even that's something I need to be aware of, is how I perceive myself. Like, I probably shouldn't be harder on myself than Jesus would have been on me.
Because that's interesting, because it's almost a rejection of Jesus to
Right.
do that and what he's saying.
Right. And it is clear that, and it does seem like Judas did doubt that. Maybe after all this whole situation, that Judas did also have this sense of shame, but also this just feeling of deception, because if he didn't live to see Jesus's resurrection, he may have died believing that Jesus was not who he said he was.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, either way, he did say, like, I betrayed innocent blood. So regardless, he at least understood that Jesus was innocent of whatever
Right.
they were saying. And he probably was like, I'm the guilty party, not him. He's the one being punished, not me. I need to go punish myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think that's still the biggest obstacle to accepting the gospel message, is that it's unfair, or it's not just, that that we have to do something to redeem ourselves. It's kind of I don't know if that's a Western culture idea, but that it's if you want to be the honorable person in the story, you have to take responsibility for your own actions, and you have to make things right. You can't just let somebody else pay the price for your crime or your sin. And in a lot of ways, I think that's kind of the biggest obstacle to accepting grace. It's just that it's undeserved.
Yeah. I have responsibility for my own sin, and I need to take care of it, versus accepting that Jesus pays for that sin on our behalf. And then out of that forgiveness and gift, I am then compelled to do the same for the next person. And that is the fuel, that is the life that flows through me, that should inform how I treat and love other people, because I see what has been done for me and I'm paying that forward. So, David, what are your final words, final thoughts, things you wanted to bring up that maybe you didn't get a chance?
I just think I know for me personally, when I know that I've failed and I've fallen short, the narrative in my head is that the Christian life should be one of continuous improvement. That today should be better than we were yesterday, and I think all the disciples kind of fly in the face of that. They were all still making mistakes, and Jesus was okay with that. He knew that they were going to make mistakes before they made the mistakes. And he knew that they were going to betray him, that Peter was going to deny him, so for some reason I have in my head that God expects me to do better today than I did yesterday, and better tomorrow than today. And if I don't, then I failed, and that self-condemnation starts to creep in. And I think Judas is really a cautionary tale to say, if we choose to condemn ourselves, Jesus will let us do that. God will let us condemn ourselves for our own sins and give us the punishment we deserve. But that's not what he wants, and that's why Jesus came to take that weight of that sin and condemnation off of us. So I think that's just looking at the story through Judas' perspective. I think that's what makes it so tragic, is that he had available to him redemption and escape from the condemnation that he inflicted on himself.
Yeah. And I suppose that your expectation of this story and of him was different when you came to that conclusion than when you started exploring this.
Yeah. I mean, he was just the one-dimensional bad guy before. There was no opportunity for redemption, and I think that's really the biggest thing, is that he was just like the other disciples. At least seemingly, he was failing along the way, just like the rest of them. But his ultimate failure, while we look at that as like the one unforgivable sin in all of eternity, really was just another failure. That was no bigger to God or to Jesus than any other.
Yeah, and for me, that's so reassuring to know that God knows those things, and yet he still offers that gift and that invitation to participate, despite all those failings that have happened and will continue to happen. So
Yeah.
Ashley, what are your final thoughts? What else would you like to say here?
Kind of just piggybacking off of David's analysis, there is just looking at the story of Judas and realizing that you are your own worst enemy in your own mind. And that when the biggest thing about making mistakes and committing things that we feel guilty or shame over is that taking the path of Peter led to the better end result, going back and repenting and asking for forgiveness and not taking it into our own hands, but trusting that others will offer up grace the same way that I try to offer grace to other people, but not just seeing myself as the one who's always going to be condemned of those things.
Yeah. It's there's a lot for us to learn and to process and to grow in a story that can be so easily simplified. And it's in that complexity that we get these kind of really interesting and unexpected, for me, insights. This is one of those sections that I was like, okay, what is there to talk about? And then realizing there's a lot to talk about here. So Talitha, what would be your final thoughts and words for us?
Well, in looking at Judas, and we compared to a little bit with Peter and how they both approached their different betrayals, just the idea that you can't force God to do what he's not going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a lot of stories like this remind me that I don't always know God's plan. And sometimes most of the time, his plan is better than mine.
Yeah.
And I may not understand it, and it may not look anything like I think it should look, but it's always better in the end.
Yeah.
And I just have to trust that and not put God in this little box that I want him to fit in, and I want him to act and behave exactly this way because it makes my life so much easier.
Yeah.
And that's just not how it works. And
Yeah.
you see what happens when people expect God to do and behave in certain ways, and he doesn't.
Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful connection to Christ's prayer in the garden, the agony, not my will, but your will be done. Right.
Yeah.
And as much as we might not know what God's will is, or as much as we might not want it in the most severe degree, are we willing to trust him with that? And it reminds me of a quote that I'll paraphrase from C.S. Lewis, but he talks about this: his conception of God is continually shattered by God, and then it shatters, and then it's rebuilt, and then it's broken again, and then it's rebuilt, and each time he gets a better picture of who God is in that process. So, well, thank you so much for joining and having the conversation. That was great, and I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you.